Hey, welcome to the Talk Spot. This is Marcus, and today I'm joined by Dr. Martin L. Pall. Dr. Pall, thank you for coming on.
My pleasure.
All right, so how would you describe your work on 5G, and what is 5G for people that maybe don't understand?
Well, 5G is just a term for what they talk about as the fifth generation of cell phone radiation. I mean, a lot of this stuff I think actually is probably not going to be cell phones. It'll be other types of devices. But where you have wireless communication, it's even faster than any of the preceding types of cell phones. So it will involve very large amounts of very rapid pulsations. And it's the pulsations actually that make it much more dangerous. In general, when you go from 2G to 3G, there was much more pulsations. 3G to 4G, there's much more pulsations, and then 4G to 5G, still more, vastly more pulsations. Pulsations make the EMFs, electromagnetic fields, much more biologically active and therefore much more dangerous.
So when did the first generation, when did that debut? Like, has this been going on for a long time, or is this more of a last 20 years kind of a thing?
I'm not sure what 1G is, to tell you the truth. But 2G was around 20 years ago.
Okay. So obviously you've written about the extensive effects that 5G could have on people. What are the health effects of 5G?
Well, I think in order to talk about those, we have to talk about the health effects of 3G and other types of microwave radiation. So all the main things that we're exposed to were actually quite dangerous, even though the industry doesn't tell you that and the government doesn't tell you that. So, we have a lot of effects from, for instance, people living near cell phone towers. There are also effects from Wi-Fi and from smart meters and from cell phone radiation itself and other types of wireless communications. And also from radar, which we're also exposed to in the environment. All these things have, pretty similar effects, although the extent of the effects are vary from one to another, but they all are substantial. They have substantial impacts on our health. And so those things involve many different effects, including the effects on the brain that lead to neurological and neuropsychiatric effects, which are widespread in our societies. The reproductive effects, both male and female reproduction, are impacted. We have effects on the structure of the testis, the structure of the ovaries, sperm counts, sperm motility, sperm quality. We have effects, and this has been studied in animals, where you get decreases in the number of eggs produced in females. We have increased spontaneous abortion, both the animals and humans. And we have lowered levels of each of the three types of sex hormones and lowered libido. So all those things are going on, and all those things impact reproduction.
Wait, so you're saying that EMFs generally, or 5G, can actually cause people to basically, I guess, become more impotent, or just be less able to reproduce?
Yeah, EMFs generally have that effect, and I expect that 5G will be much worse than anything we've been exposed to, for reasons that we need to discuss. But we already have major effects, and of those types, we also have effects on the DNA of our cells, where you get three different types of DNA damage that can cause mutations. We have effects on essentially every hormone system in the body. We have cardiac effects on the electrical control of the heart that involve arrhythmias and also both tachycardia, rapid heartbeat, and over longer time periods, bradycardia, slow heartbeat. All those things are going on. Those aren't the only things that I think are going on, but those are among the things that are most documented. And at the cellular level, we get, in addition to DNA effects, we get oxidative stress, which has roles in essentially every chronic disease. We also get increases in what's called apoptosis, which is programmed cell death, which is important for generating the reproductive and the neurodegenerative effects. So we haven't talked about the neurodegenerative effects, but they're obviously very important. So there's all kinds of things going on, and people are simply not told about these, even though they're extremely well documented. So
is this only happening near the towers, or is this just like, for example, like if someone, let's say, they have 5G internet at their house and their phone is hooked up to it and their computer and every other, device they have, is that able to cause those effects just on those people, even if they don't live near a cell tower? Or
well, the problem with 5G is that, and let me just say, 5G is being put out along with 4G, such that they will work together. But the so-called small cells that are being put out in a number of places around the country are being put out in close proximity to our homes, schools, hospitals, businesses, almost everything. So very, very large numbers of these, and they will then impact essentially everyone because we can't avoid them. They're all over the place. And and we will be impacted both by the 4G radiation and the 5G radiation, both of them being highly pulsed, and therefore, we have every expectation that they'll be much more dangerous than anything we've had previously.
So, like they have the Doomsday Clock when it was, that nuclear war was imminent or whatever, and it was, 2 minutes to midnight. I mean, if this was on that kind of clock, like how much of a threat is 5G really to society in general? Like, where would you put that? Like, is this a mild threat, or is this like a close to midnight kind of one? Because I remember, when we spoke on the phone before this interview, you mentioned to me that, especially in the U.S., we're very crisis out. We've so many crises all the time. There's always so many things happening that generally people just kind of start tuning out when they hear more things. But where would you put this threat to like Americans' health?
Well, I mean, we are crisis fatigued, as you said, and and a lot of us think, oh well, I can't deal with another crisis. Unfortunately, this thing is happening, right now, in different places around the country, and so in order to answer that question, what I have to tell you is that I've made estimates about how fast we will be very severely impacted by two of the effects that we're already seeing, namely the neurological, neuropsychiatric effects and the reproductive effects. And there, I think we're talking about a few years, based on the exposures we've already had, that we will go into massive crash in reproduction, essentially to zero. And I think we're already seeing signs of that in different parts of the technologically advanced countries in the world. But similarly, a lot of the neuropsychiatric effects, they include things that are already highly advanced. Can't sleep, I'm tired all the time, I'm depressed, my memory doesn't work, I've got headaches, I've got, I'm anxious, all the things that, that almost everybody is complaining about, we know are caused by EMFs, and yet, we're not warning people about them, and we're not doing anything about them. So, and those are caused by each of the exposures that I already mentioned, in addition to the smart meter radiation, which also cause those kinds of effects. We are being exposed to multiple types of radiation which cause these things already, and those are already highly advanced in our societies. And when we look at them, and this is based both on the occupational exposure studies that were done back in the 1970s and 1980s, when we had very few exposures in the general environment. You can see that things are cumulative, that as they get worse and worse with time, as the time of exposure to a particular type of EMF, let's say, in this case, in those cases, we were looking at occupational exposures. But, now we're looking at the other things that we just talked about. They are cumulative, and they work rapidly, and you can make an estimate of how fast we'll get before our collective brain function crashes. And I estimated about a year ago it's probably something like 5 to 7 years. That's based on the exposures we already have. You put in 5G, it could be, easily 10 times faster. Could be extraordinarily fast. So we're talking about crises of the sort that we've never faced before, with the sole exception being of instant nuclear annihilation. And let me just say, we know how all these things can occur. So we can talk about that, how you can get these effects from these low-intensity EMFs. So it's not a great mystery about how these things can be caused by them. And that's true of all of the effects that I mentioned before. We know how they can occur, and so it's not a great mystery. Although the industry wants to claim that there isn't any mechanism, but that's simply untrue.
Well, would you mind going into that a little bit?
Sure. Okay. So you want to talk about mechanism?
Yeah,
is
sure.
Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So the primary mechanism, and this is my own work, and it's not based on my own experimental studies, but it's based on studies that were in the literature, which no one really realized how important they were. And so what I've done is to take the information that had already been reported, some of it going back to the 1970s, and others much more recent, and show how this shows what kind of effects, what kind of immediate effects are going on. So what's happening is that we have, every cell in our body is surrounded by a membrane called the plasma membrane. In that membrane, there are some channels. These are proteins that can open up and allow compounds to flow through the membrane, and that are called voltage-gated calcium channels. And so those are things that are, when they open up, allow calcium to flow into the cell. And in general, when you intracellular calcium is kept about 1/10,000th of the concentration outside the cell. So when you open those channels, you get large amounts of calcium flowing in the cell, and that causes almost all of the effects that we see, including all the ones that I mentioned and a number of others. So how does it work? I mean, basically, what happens is that you get these increases in intracellular calcium. One of the things they cause is excessive calcium signaling. So that's one thing. And then the other thing which they cause, which is also very important in producing these damaging effects, what are called pathophysiological effects, are that you get increases in nitric oxide and superoxide, and they react with each other to form peroxynitrite, which is a potent oxidant, and produces lots of highly reactive free radicals, which attack a lot of things in the cells, and also cause inflammation. So you get oxidative stress as a consequence, and inflammation as a consequence of that. All of these things then, produce effects in the body, depending on which tissue they're occurring in. So basically, all the things we talked about can be produced in these two ways, along these two pathways, these nitric oxide signaling pathway and the peroxynitrite pathway. There are also therapeutic effects of these EMFs that can occur under certain conditions, where you have an appropriate level of EMF exposures, and you focus that on a particular part of the body that needs some help. There are genuine therapeutic effects that can occur as well, and we know how those can occur in addition. So there are quite a number of things that we know about these, and so we know how all those, all the effects that I mentioned before can be produced through the excessive calcium in the cell. So anyway, and then the question is, why is 5G so dangerous? And I think it's basically because 5G is designed to be extraordinarily highly pulsed in order to carry huge amounts of information per unit time. Be even more pulsed than 4G, which is more pulsed than 3G, which is much more pulsed than 2G. And the pulsations we know are very, very important in terms of producing effects in the body. The pulsations also work via activation of these channels, as you might expect. So they all work through the same target, and so the combination of having all of these antennae in close proximity to basically everywhere we're going to be means that the effects are going to be vastly more dangerous, and therefore I believe can be massively destructive within a very short time period, a period of months. So I'm deeply concerned about 5G, and I'm also deeply concerned about the 4G in the small antennae, because that has major effects as well. Yeah, I mean, this seems totally unbelievable. And I want to state that right up front. It seems totally unbelievable that we would be doing this. But the fact is that what we are doing is putting out 5G and 4G, for that matter, without doing one single biological safety test on either one. All of the claims of safety are based on safety guidelines, which we know do not predict biological effects and therefore do not predict safety. So those claims are bogus.
So who is controlling the rollout of 5G? I mean, is this something where, is this Verizon and AT&T, or is this a governmental thing? Who's behind administering this and building the towers and everything?
Well, the FCC is pushing this technology. So the FCC has been given the power to regulate it, and they are pushing this technology. It's actually the companies that are putting out the actual antennae. So it's both, really. And the FCC, has been informed about the dangers, and they simply pretend they don't exist. I mean, this is absolutely bizarre. I mean, and it's almost unbelievable that we could be in this kind of situation.
I mean, there's so many things that happen, from a concerned citizen standpoint to the government, where there's just lawsuits all the time. I was reading an article the other day, about the ACLU. They're suing the administration over, basically asylum cases and things like that. And, you hear about all of these, basically lawsuits against the government. Are there any lawsuits like this happening now against the building of the antennae, like you mentioned, and the whole, just this basically, the rolling out of 5G without it necessarily being, like you said, biologically tested? I mean, is the ACLU, or are they involved in a lawsuit with this, or is there basically mum's the word on this?
Well, it's neither one. We have lawsuits from quite a number of different cities around the country on this. The problem is that the 1996 Telecommunications Act gave the FCC the power to regulate, and that includes the ability to determine what's safe and what's unsafe, even though the FCC has no competence to do that. That law has been interpreted that we don't have the power to protect our health, and that local governments don't have that power. There have been some attempts to challenge that, but and there also are lawsuits that have to do with other aspects of this, including the FCC claims that they can overrule local zoning decisions, that that local and state governments don't have any rights to protect their people through zoning. So there are a lot of things that are highly questionable, and I think many of us think that they are highly questionable from a constitutional standpoint, but they're also questionable from the standpoint of the what's called the Nuremberg Code, which was established after World War II because of the atrocities that went on during the war, that are supposed to protect us from being experimented on, which is what's going on here. It's not clear the extent to which the Nuremberg Code has legal implications in U.S. courts. So I can't really say whether a challenge on that basis will be upheld or not. But the point is that what's being done is just, I think, one of the great atrocities that we've ever had, and perhaps the greatest that we've ever had. I am extraordinarily concerned about this. And let me say one other thing about 5G, which I think is important. 5G will be using millimeter waves, which are higher frequencies than the microwaves that are used for most other things. It turns out that when you go up in the millimeter wave range, that those frequencies are absorbed in terms of the electrical activity much more readily by building materials and by our bodies than our microwaves. And so the industry has claimed that all the effects, or almost all the effects, will be in the outer 1 millimeter or so of the body. It turns out that that's not true. We know from millimeter wave studies that have been done previously, and these are not the highly pulsed EMFs that 5G will be, but simply just the millimeter waves alone without pulsations, that they do actually act much more deeply than what the industry claims is possible. And I've discussed in some of my writings how that can happen. So the point is that we will get really very heavy effects right near the surface of the body, but there will also be important effects much deeper in the body. And with the high level of pulsations, I predict that those deep effects will be very severe as well. Now, the only way to test that is through biological safety testing. And that is what the FCC and the industry are avoiding doing. They're not doing any biological safety testing of genuine 5G radiation with all of its pulsations. So we are being literally attacked by these things without any protection from the government, which is encouraging this attack. And this is going on over much of the world. This isn't just in the U.S. It's going on all over the place. And let me say, you and I have just been talking about the human effects, but I believe there will be massive ecological impacts of these of the sorts that we can barely imagine, because many organisms have much higher surface to volume ratios, including essentially all plants and all smaller animals, and so they will almost certainly be much more heavily impacted than we will, and I expect that we are going to be very, very heavily impacted. So anybody who cares about the environment should be deeply concerned. Anybody who concerned about anything having to do with humanity needs to be deeply concerned about this.
I mean, would you say, would it be a stretch to say something like maybe 10 to 15 years from now, so 5G will totally be in full effect. Maybe they're even working on 6G. I don't know how long it takes for each generation, but would you be surprised to see if, the American population, if our, oh my gosh, I'm trying to think of the term, if our, our, oh my gosh, the age of death, the average age of death, if that were to decrease, I forgot how old it is now. I think for women, I think it's 77 or 76. Would you be surprised if this caused life expectancy to drop?
No, I expect it to be much worse than what you're outlining. Much worse.
Wow. So
the reason is that the impact on our collective brain function is one of the things that will have the most massive effects. And by the way, the effect on the structure of the brain has been studied in animals, and you get effects on the structure of the brain that again are cumulative and become much more severe with increasing times of exposure. We have, as I've already stated, the evidence that these neuropsychiatric effects are already highly advanced in our society. Based on the exposures we already have, we will have very rapid effects as they accumulate, completely apart from 5G, completely apart from further expansion of 4G, completely apart from putting radar units in cars so they can drive themselves. Each of those involving major increases in exposures. I think, when you talk about what's going to happen in 15 years, we won't be here in 15 years the way we're going. Even without 5G, we won't be here in 15 years.
I mean, what can be, like, from a practical standpoint, like what can be done? Like if you were, let's just say, for example, like if you were given ultimate authority, like what would that look like? I mean, how can things be reversed at least reverse as much as possible? Like what would be the practical policy, like, I guess, implications, or what could we do to reverse this?
Well, the first thing we have to do is stop our increasing exposures. I mean, that's obvious. But when you ask, about our technologies and can we benefit from them without these kinds of effects, I think the answer is clearly yes, we can. But we're not doing so. I mean, we're not doing it in any sensible way. So, for example, we don't need Wi-Fi at all. We can do everything wired, or we could do it through like an infrared pulsations instead of microwave pulsations, which is what we're doing now, which are much less dangerous. But we're simply not doing things in any sensible way. The same thing, for instance, is true of cordless phone radiation. Cordless phones, which we haven't talked about, are also quite dangerous, and we have cordless phones where the bases radiate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They don't need to do that. They only need to radiate when you're getting a call or when you're placing a call. But they're extraordinarily poorly designed, and even the phones themselves are extraordinarily poorly designed. Why? Because they're designed to usually work like 400 feet or at least several hundred feet away from the base. How often do we use them that far away? Not very. So, we could easily have a little switch on a cordless phone where you could cut down the radiation by a factor of 100 when you're much closer to the base. But we don't do that. So, it's incredibly stupid what we're doing, incredibly destructive what we're doing. Right now, we have, we've had 17 studies on people living near cell phone towers and what happens to them. And what's been shown is every single one of these show effects in these people of the sorts that we just discussed. And they, typically in people who live within 300 meters of a cell phone tower. A large fraction of the population lives within 300 meters of the cell phone tower. Jeez. So we're having a lot of people impacted by that. Now, there are countries that have safety guidelines that are 100 times more stringent than ours with regard to cell phone tower radiation. They still have cell phones. And so we could cut down that by simply having more stringent safety guidelines, but we're not doing anything. We're moving and when you produce these small cells, you're running as fast as you can in exactly the wrong direction. You're going out to greatly increase exposures. It's sheer lunacy what we're doing. And as I said before, we know how these things work. And we know that they are dangerous in very important ways. And so, it's my opinion that 5G could easily destroy us in many ways within, whether the destruction occurs within months, that the process itself could be fixed within months. So, for example, we know that there were a series of studies done two studies published in rats, where it was shown that all you had to do to convert perfectly normal rats into very early onset Alzheimer's rats that have the four of the characteristic features of Alzheimer's in humans, is to give those as young rats a series of short pulses, EMF pulses, electromagnetic field pulses. That's all you have to do. So we have every reason to think that the highly pulsed 5G radiation, and in fact it could well be even other types of radiation, could easily produce very early onset Alzheimer's dementias, people age 30 coming down with Alzheimer's, which we're seeing now. They're still quite rare, but we are seeing them for the first time. We have every reason to think that this might happen from 5G radiation. I can't tell you for certain it's going to happen because nobody has looked. But that's exactly the problem. Nobody is looking. There is no biological safety testing on this stuff. Now if 5G does this, it may not do it, instantaneously. There's typically a long latency period, in Alzheimer's disease, from the time that the process starts to the time they actually see symptoms. So it won't necessarily, but it could well be the case that people who are exposed to 5G radiation within months could be started on this way to develop very early onset Alzheimer's dementias. And we have no idea whether, there have been no studies done to determine whether this is likely to happen. And this is just one of I believe 6 different ways in which 5G can easily destroy us. Certainly, and so some of the others will show up much more rapidly.
Yeah, what would you say? So I mean, those other 5 or 6, what are they besides the one that you've already mentioned? Like, what are some of the other potential effects? I guess if you wouldn't mind, maybe listing all of the major effects at one time, so people can really understand the full grasp of this.
Okay. Well, okay. So the neurological and neuropsychiatric effects we talked about before, and the underlying mechanism, as it has been studied in animals, appears to be the changes in the structure of the brain that occur cumulatively with time. So those are major concerns, and let me just say, when you look at the changes in the structure of the brains that have been shown in experimental animals, it's absolutely stunning what's happening there. That you see massive effects on their brains, and so I believe that the neurological and neuropsychiatric effects, the cumulative effects that we see in humans, are caused by underlying changes in brain structure. So,
when you say that, do you mean, are you talking things like depression, anxiety, suicide, like things like that, or is this something different, like epilepsy or like something more physical?
Well, you do get. They're all physical. They're all physical. I mean, we're talking about changes. When you talk about psychiatric disease, there are physical changes in the neurophysiology of the brain in these things. And in fact, there are things that are very similar to what's caused when you have EMF exposures. So these things these things do occur. They are physiological. The fact that you see, psychological or psychiatric symptoms does not mean that there's not real physiology that's going on there. So okay, so that's one, and the reproductive effects is the second one. So let's talk about the reproductive effects and how far along we are already in terms of reproduction. And most of the effects actually have been studied in humans. That really have to do with in human populations have to do with male reproduction, which is easier to study than the other things. There was a meta-analysis published by Levine et al. In late 2017, which showed that every single sperm counts had dropped to below 50% of normal in every single technologically advanced country on Earth. Now, I can't tell you for certain that that's caused by EMFs, but what I can tell you is EMFs can do that, and we don't have any other hypothesis of how that explains how these can be produced. Okay, so and there was a very recent publication in Switzerland where it was shown that that young males who should be among the most fertile because they're young had the 62% were infertile of young males in Switzerland were infertile. That's a recent study, and there are some other studies that showed somewhat similar effects in 3 other European countries. So, when you have 62% of the males being impacted, and the fertility in the others is the measures of fertility are subnormal, but they still are considered fertile. The other, 38%. Everybody is being affected by this, or almost everybody is being affected by this. The notion that we have a large population that's not affected is simply untrue. And so and again, that's based on the exposures we already have, completely apart from 5G. Further expansion of 4G, putting radar units in cars, and various other things that are being planned for us. I think that we will see, and there was an animal study that was published 21 years ago now by Magris and Xenos that showed that you could take young mice and put them into EMF exposures well within our safety guidelines, so nothing should happen, and at 2 different levels of exposure. And what happened was at the higher level exposure, the mice produced, and let me just say, a litter in mice takes about 30 days. So they're really quick. And then after the young mice are born, they can produce another litter in just a little over 30 days later. What was found was that this EMF exposure, at the higher level exposure, you got a decreased number of pups in the first litter, and also a decreased number in the second litter versus normals, and then no third litter. So the reproduction crashed to 0, or essentially 0, and apparently irreversibly, or almost completely irreversibly, because you take the rats, or the mice rather, out of the EMF fields, they show almost no recovery in their reproduction. So and basically the same thing happened at the lower level exposure, except it was the 5th litter that crashed to 0. So what we have here is a situation where, I would predict we're going to see crashes in human populations, and I think we're already seeing that in 3 densely populated high-technology East Asian countries. And those are Singapore, which had a 31% drop in reproduction between 2016 and 2017. Macau, which isn't really a separate country, but it has separate statistics, had a 26% drop in reproduction. South Korea had a 11% drop in reproduction, same years, 2016, 2017. And the figures in South Korea for the first 6 months of 2018 are out, and had another approximate 9% drop in reproduction. So those countries are having very unusual drops in reproduction. I mean, these kinds of drops are usually only seen, when you have a war, you have a famine, or you have a massive economic collapse. And none of those things are relevant here. So those are not what are causing these drops. And as I said before, we're seeing very high levels of male infertility now in young males in Europe, particularly in Switzerland, where this recent study came out, but also in 3 other European countries. And so, I expect we're going to see crashes in many countries around the world, and over the next 2, 3, 4 years, we're going to see crashes in reproduction. So the question is, what happens when we wake up one day and basically, your country is essentially extinct because your reproduction has dropped, down well below 20% of replacement levels. Let me just say that, we're seeing, the same group of countries that I mentioned before where sperm counts have dropped below 50% of normal. Their reproductive rate had dropped well below replacement levels, also by 2017, in every single one of those countries, with a single exception, and they averaged about 73% of replacement levels. Now you can say, well, maybe we got too many people, and maybe that's just fine. Yeah, and maybe it is, but if you drop to 0, then that's not fine, and that's the kind of thing we're looking at into the future, the way things are going. And as I've already said, we have reasons to think that that's already far along, in these 3 East Asian countries, but also, we're seeing big effects in many of the European countries. The very large increases in male infertility. Infertility in previous times, 20, 30 years ago, it was much more common that infertility of couples was caused by dysfunction in the female rather than the male. Now, infertility is much more commonly caused in the males, and that may have to do with the fact that the testis is one of the most sensitive organs in the body to the impact of the EMFs.
So what are some of the other health effects? So there's the effects that it has on the brain. There's effects that it has on sexual reproduction. Yeah. Does 5G, does that lead to higher rates of cancer?
I'm sure it will. So the problem with 5G is nobody's looked. There's no data on it. We do have data on millimeter waves, which are non-pulsed, which not the highly pulsed 5G. So there's simply no data on 5G, which will be extraordinarily highly pulsed. So the predictions are based on what we know about EMFs and what we know about the role of pulsations. And so, those are the predictions which argue that 5G will be, as I said, vastly more dangerous than anything else that we've been exposed to. And as I've already said, we are already being highly affected by previous types of radiation that we've been exposed to. And a number of those effects are highly advanced in our population. Certainly the reproductive and the neurological, neuropsychiatric effects are. I'm also very concerned about mutational effects produced by the DNA. So I mentioned there are effects, and maybe I didn't mention this. There are effects on the cellular DNA, where the cellular DNA is impacted by the EMFs. And they produce 3 different types of DNA changes, each of which can produce mutations. And so we have both single-strand and double-stranded breaks in the cellular DNA, and we have oxidized bases in the cellular DNA, and each of those can cause important mutations. And those, in turn, can cause cancer. So cancer is a major concern here. I think they will. And we know that human sperm is impacted. The DNA in human sperm is impacted by EMFs that we're commonly exposed to, things like Wi-Fi and cell phone radiation, for example. So we have every expectation that will have that the exposures we already have are probably having a big effect on mutations frequency. I have to say I haven't been able to find any good data on what's happened to human mutation frequencies over the last 15 or 20 years. So I don't know how far along those are, but they are of great concern. But with regard to cancer, you raised the question. I mean, so let me just say there are 38 or 39 different reviews which have shown that EMFs, electromagnetic fields of the sorts we were talking about, can go completely apart from putting radar units in cars so they can drive themselves. Each of those, cancer is caused by EMFs. But the only reason why we're still discussing this is because the industry is so powerful in it, and it can dominate a lot of the discussion on these things. But now, with regard to 5G, I expect that that cancer will be much more active from 5G, and much for the same reasons it's going to be more active in every other way. But it will be particularly active with regard to cells that are near the surface of the body. So, and those could easily include malignant melanomas and leukemias and lymphomas, because the blood, of course, circulates around so that it's close to the surface of the body, and there may be many other things that are caused near the surface as well. So that's a big issue. But as I said before, I expect with the very high level of pulsations, there will be very strong effects internally in the body, and that, of course, can lead to cancer as well. Cancer is obviously important here, but in my judgment, I put it down around number 6 or 7 on my list of concerns. So I'm much more concerned about a lot of the other things that are going on. Although cancer is a big concern, it's a major concern, and it's not. And I don't want to. I'm not trying to minimize it. What I'm saying is that we have other things that are much closer to being existential threats and imminent existential threats to our survival.
I mean, so do you think so? I mean, let's say, 3 years from now or 4 years from now, I mean, when we see the uptick in, Alzheimer's in young people, and we see, basically, I mean, like you're saying, I mean, you can measure the birth rates. I mean, if those are, if they dip so, if the dip is so precipitous, I mean, they'll have to be at that point, won't there be a bunch of legal fights going on? I mean, won't society take notice of that, or what will? I mean, I just feel like that'll definitely make the news, right? I mean, wouldn't that be a topic of major discussion when all of these things are really manifesting themselves?
Well, yeah, you'd hope so. Of course, yeah. If you have, the problem basically is the following. Everything is dependent on our collective brain function. If our collective brain function goes to hell, we just go into chaos. And I think that's what's going to happen. I think it's going to happen very quickly. When you look around the world and you ask, are there any countries, so that, let me just backtrack a minute here. My worst fear in all of this is that our collective brain function is already disintegrated to the point where we can't deal with this. When you look around the world and you ask, is any country in the world doing a good job of dealing with this? It's really hard to find anyone where you can say, hey, these people are into this, and they understand what the consequences are, and are acting vigorously to try to prevent this, or at least greatly lower it. You don't see anywhere where it's clear that there are vigorous attempts to deal with this, and it obviously needs vigorous attempts. So we are in absolutely extraordinary trouble. And you have, regulatory agencies that, are still claiming that the safety guidelines tell us about safety, which they don't. And we can simply assume that because the safety guidelines say it's okay, that it is okay. And yet we have extraordinary amounts of information that shows just exactly the contrary. And that's that's the situation in the U.S. It's the situation in Canada. It's the situation in Europe. It's the situation in East Asia, and all these countries are being heavily impacted, and that's but you can't find anywhere where it's clear that there are some cities that have said, well, we're not going to allow 5G, and maybe that'll hold. In a number of the European cities have done that. It's not clear in the U.S. whether any American attempts to block it will be successful at this point. And you have other cities that have just gone along with it. Many of them.
So let's say from a standpoint of someone listening to our discussion, or mostly to the information that you've provided us today, like what would be like the actionable thing we can do? Like what kind of action can normal people take to either reverse this or stop its impact on them? Like what's something that your average person that just has a normal job, whatever they do,
yeah,
what can be done, like from our standpoint?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there are two levels in which you can answer that question. One has to do with the issue of protecting individuals and families, and the other has to do with the society as a whole. And we need to do both. We need to be active at both levels, because we need people who protect themselves so that we have some chance of recovering from this. But we also need to have effects on the society as a whole, because, as I say, if our collective brain function goes to hell, we're going to go into utter chaos. And then it doesn't make terribly much difference whether you've protected yourself or not. And we're talking about stuff that is worse than the worst apocalypse movie that you've ever seen. I mean, it's that kind of thing. That so there are ways in which you can shield yourself from this radiation, and you can put shielding up in your house, and you can. Unfortunately, we don't have any organizations that are put that can put up shielding in vehicles, in cars and trucks and the like. That can be done, but there's no organizations that are, to my knowledge, that are set up to do that, and it's not so easy to do that in your vehicles, but as it is in your home. But you can use things like graphite paint in your home, for instance, to shield yourself from a lot of this stuff. You wouldn't put that on your windows, but unless you want to have black windows. But the graphite paint is black, but you can always paint over it with other kinds of paint so that you're not looking at black walls and black ceilings and so forth. We have situations where but none of us, I think, want to live in a world where we can't walk around freely outside, but that's what we're looking at here. And let me just say, I believe there will be absolutely massive ecological impacts of the EMFs, of the 5G particularly, because it will have huge impacts on not only all small animals, including insects and small mammals and birds, but also on plants, because plants and EMFs work in plants very much the same way they work in the cells of our bodies. So plants are quite sensitive to these, and you know, when you drive around, you can see often, you know, trees that are near cell phone towers are dying. So you can get effects on even large trees from EMFs that we're already exposed to.
I mean, would you say would it be prudent for people to, like, I mean, what kind of government agency would we contact? Would it be you said it was the FTC, right? Would it be
FCC?
Oh, FCC.
Well, the
sorry.
FCC is totally non-responsive.
Oh.
You have to work on the Congress and city councils and state legislators to work on this. You know, a lot of the city councils say, well, we can't do anything, but they're not even trying to do what could be done, which is, you know, file lawsuits and pass resolutions, and there may be other things that they could do which would protect us, but they're not doing anything.
Because, I mean, cities can always file lawsuits against the state government or the federal government. I mean, it's always a discretion of the government if they're going to respond. But, I mean, cities always have the authority to sue, right?
Sure, yeah, they could do that. And there are cities that are doing that now in the U.S.
Wow. So, I mean, there's not really a lot of things people can do, I mean, which is...
Well, there are things that we can do as groups that we cannot do as individuals. You know, because individuals don't have a lot of clout. You know, there are some individuals that do, and their ox is being gored as well. I mean, there are a lot of people who were involved in you know, as developing things. You know, as real estate developers and other kinds of developers. And they're going to be everybody's going to be heavily impacted by this stuff, but they're going to be impacted in terms of their wealth. And some of those people are very wealthy, so they need to get involved in this for, you know, if only for their own personal, you know, financial benefit. They need to get involved in this. You know, there are many, many, many people who are being impacted by this stuff. Let me give you another example of where I think EMFs are showing up in very unusual ways. There have been a series of 29 different racehorse deaths at the Santa Anita racetrack in Southern California. If you look up, there's a search engine called Antenna Search, where you can look for where antennae have been put in. You find there, I believe, 15 different antennae that are sitting right in the middle of the Santa Anita racetrack. So they're very, very high densities of what are probably mainly 4G antennae, but there's at least one 5G antenna in there. And so those have... You know, I don't have the dates for those, but those have been put in fairly recently. So the racehorse deaths have occurred, have been of two different types. One is that what's apparent sudden cardiac death, and sudden cardiac death is caused by arrhythmias, which occur, particularly when they're associated with bradycardia, which also were produced by the EMFs. And there are animal studies that have shown that these can be caused by EMFs, and in fact, that sudden cardiac death can be caused. You know, and then there are the human studies that have been done where we have these cardiac effects occurring from EMF exposures. So it's eminently reasonable then that these antennae are causing these deaths from sudden cardiac death. The other kinds of deaths that have occurred in the racehorses are also quite interesting. There are a substantial number of them that have died of massive bone breakage. Mm. So then the question is, okay, can EMF exposures cause massive bone breakage in racehorses? And I think the answer is yes, and let me tell you how this can happen. When you activate these voltage-gated calcium channels in the cells of our bodies, what happens is you get a lot of extracellular calcium that flows into the cells, and so you get a decrease in extracellular calcium as a consequence of this. When that happens, what the body does is it secretes a lot of parathyroid hormone, parathyroid, not thyroid. So parathyroid hormone then goes out and it pulls calcium out of the bones to restore the extracellular calcium levels. Now, if you just do this once or twice, it's not a big deal. But if you keep doing it over and over and over again, you are going to massively weaken the structure of the bones. And racehorses, of course, put very large amounts of stress on their bones because they're racehorses. And so, you can get bone breakage in the leg, and then the animal can fall down, and it may have many, many other breaks as a consequence of the weakening of these bones. So it's very plausible that that these are all being caused by the EMF exposures from those antennae in the Santa Anita racetrack. So we're talking about things that when you know what the mechanism is, it tells you a lot about what's going on here. And we do know what the main mechanism is. Almost everything makes great sense now. And when you look at what's happening here, we're looking at absolutely massive effects. And yet we're not responding to them. I mean, you can't find anywhere where you can say, hey, people are responding in a sensible way to this. What we get is all the industry propaganda claiming, oh, nothing's happening. And I have to say many public agencies, and I want to mention specifically that the New York Times has had two very recent articles that are just simply straight industry propaganda. One of them just came out, I think, like 2 days ago, and the other one came out quite recently as well. So, that's where we are.
Wow. I mean, I think this all definitely kind of ties back to, what we mentioned at the beginning of the talk, that being that people are crisis fatigued. I mean, I feel like if there wasn't, 15 other things happening every week or all these other big societal issues, people could think about this. But I mean, like everything that you've described to me, it almost sounds like we're headed towards like a Children of Men scenario. Like, did you ever see that movie, or have you heard of that movie?
No.
Oh, well, it came out probably, 12 years ago, something like that. And it has Clive Owen. But basically, the plot of that movie is that nobody on Earth, like no woman on Earth can get pregnant. And it's like a dystopia, but, like the whole society, like the whole world is kind of falling apart. But, I mean, when you were describing what you said, I was thinking of that movie. And, I mean, this really is a big, impact. I mean, we didn't even talk about the fact that, that there's probably a huge rise in the number of young people that are, depressed and then have, that take some kind of form of, anxiety pills or OCD or ADD, something like that.
Depression is caused by EMF exposures. We know that. I mean, that's one of the neuropsychiatric effects that are seen quite commonly is depression. So yeah, I mean, but that's the thing. There's so much going on here. I mean, there's so many different things that are going on. I mean, let me tell you another thing which I think is highly probable, but not yet dead certain, and that is that primary driver, in my judgment, the primary driver of the autism epidemic are EMF exposure. Part of the reason that I think that that's true is because we know that these mutations that cause the voltage-gated calcium channels to be more active. So these are mutations in the genes that encode them, that those mutations can cause autism. And in fact, from genetic polymorphism studies in those genes, we know that the activity of those channels are very important in terms of causing autism in the broader autism population. And we have other kinds of evidence that argues that intracellular calcium has a key causal role in causing autism. I mean, it's thought that the main mechanism that's involved in causing autism has to do with the formation of the synapses in the developing brain. So the ways in which the connections between different neurons in the brain that occur are very, very rapidly occurring during what's called the perinatal period, the period just before birth and after birth, are very, very important in terms of forming the synapses in the developing brain. And there are 5 mechanisms that regulate the synapse formation, and each of them are regulated by intracellular calcium. So intracellular calcium has an absolutely key role in that process. And so, what do the EMFs do? They cause these very large increases in intracellular calcium. So anyway, the more you look, the worse it gets.
The more you've said, the more it's just like, oh my gosh, it's so shocking to me that it seems like there's a concerted effort, like you were saying, just around the whole world to just not question this, and it's just happening. And I mean, it almost seems like it's a little bit of a dirty secret, or it's the redheaded stepchild where everyone wants to just pretend doesn't exist or something like that, or the black sheep, or no one. I came across your work. It was aggregate news site. It was something like, the headline was, "Does 5G cause health concerns?" or something like that. Mm-hmm. And, the only place before reading, that article that was talking about your work, I'd only come across this idea of 5G's effects on people's health. I saw some, there'd be some videos on YouTube, but it was, like amateur type, I guess you would say. I mean, they weren't doctors, and they weren't, it wasn't like a major news organization. And yeah, it just seems like there's this information. I mean, people like you, obviously you're writing about it and publishing papers, but the overall societal impacts, I mean, no one's talking about it.
Certainly not enough people are talking about it. I mean, we've got this, what is it, July 27th, I guess, is supposed to be a nationwide day of protest on this. Hopefully that'll generate some awareness here. It's not clear. I mean, I think the media are going in the right direction, but it's way too slow. The media broadly are starting to cover this, but it's still way, way less than what we need, and that's really tragic, I think.
Well, Dr. Pall, before I let you go, how can we follow your work? How can we, access or read, the papers I write? I mean, obviously the things that you write, they're not necessarily, they're very complex. Obviously, since you're a doctor, I mean, you're not writing things in like a blog post, but how can we follow your work? How can we read the papers that you write? Obviously I know that you're a working professor, so not everything you write is necessarily like available online for non-students.
Well, there are a number of things you can actually get. For instance, I've got 6 articles, that you can find in the PubMed database, so PUBMED. You can find them by just putting in my name, and you have to spell the last name Pall, which is so put in Martin Pall and electromagnetic, and you'll find I believe 6 articles in there. 5 of those are public access, so you can download them full text at no cost from the publisher's website just by clicking. There's a place you can click in the upper right corner that you can access them as PDF files. So you can download them and print them out, email them to people, whatever you want to do. The first paper that I published on this was published in 2013, so quite recently. And that paper has been cited now, I think, 223 times according to the Google Scholar database. So there's been a lot of attention to that study, which is good, in the scientific community. Actually, I'm just going to go in and see if that number has changed while we're doing it, while we're talking here. Anyway.
So there are papers that you've written that people...
Those papers are there. I wrote the most important thing I've written, actually, other than those papers, which I told you about, is a 90-page document which you can access on the internet, from a number of different sites. That is a 7-chapter document. The last chapter is on 5G. And let me just say, so that discusses all the stuff. So you can access that by just putting in my name, Martin Pall, Pall, and electromagnetic, and 5G, and the date of it, which is May 17th, 2018. Otherwise, you'll find a whole bunch of other things. Anyway, you can download that. That document has been translated into German and Italian and Norwegian, and a precursor of it was translated into French. That there's been a lot of interest in that document. In Chapter 5 and Chapter 6 in that document discusses the corruption of the science. Chapter 5 is about a European organization that goes by the acronym CENIHR, SCENIHR, which is very important. And then Chapter 6 is about the corruption in the U.S. And the reason that, there's been so much corruption in the science, and so, it needs a lot of attention. So it's up to 231 now citations on that paper.
I'll put a link in the description to that piece or to that paper so people can actually, like you said more explicitly, is chapters 5, 6, and 7 would probably be the ones that are more relevant to what we're talking or what we've talked about. So I'll definitely.
They go into some of the considerations. And you can act. Sometimes it's better to use another search engine other than Google for some of these things. Anyway, yeah.
Well, yeah, I definitely want to thank you, Dr. Pall, so much for coming on and talking about this. And hopefully, maybe we can come on again another time. Maybe, obviously, I know you've done so much work, so there's litany of different subjects to talk about. But yeah, hopefully next time we connect, this maybe some good steps will be taken, or at least steps in the right direction will be taken to kind of, like you said, kind of turn the tide a little bit on this. But yeah, definitely, I want to thank you again so much, and thank you for your time.